Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the Horus Heresy lore breakdown. I think we're going to do the death of a Silversmith and Prince of Crows in this one video, because Death of a Silversmith is a very inconsequential story. It's a fairly good story, and I think if it had been woven into, say, the first 3 Horus Rising books, it would have made an excellent little side leap. Something to add a little bit of weight to the rest of the proceedings, and something to add in a little bit of intrigue. Perhaps even a little bit of a prequel story, since it includes Hustor Sejanus. But instead we get it here, where it really, again, it's well written, it's a decent story, but it has practically no impact on anything else in the wider story of the Horus Heresy and 30k, meaning it's a little bit pointless. But nevertheless, we'll touch upon that a little bit first, and then we will move on to Arendemski Bowden's Prince of Crows. So, Death of a Silversmith. It does give a little bit of an interesting view into what was the Remembrance Order, or indeed even before the Remembrance Order became a real thing, since our main character here is an artisan of considerable talent in making trinkets and embellishments and pretty little baubles and so on. He was sought out by Malcador the Sigillite personally, and Malcador had with him a letter, apparently also written, literally, by the Emperor himself. Or at the very least, it is heavily insinuated that it was written by the God Emperor. Now that is significant because it tells you that this wasn't some passing fancy he had, or something he did for just sheer political convenience or anything like that. He sat down as the Emperor and took the time to write a personal letter to some random silversmith. You don't do that unless you are fairly invested, which tells us now that the Remembrance Order, or at the very least the idea of it, was very much so a personal pet project of the Emperor, and something that he wanted to see be brought to completion. It presents him as a patron of the arts, and someone who genuinely did seem to think that the achievements of the Astartes needed to be remembered. It also gives us a suggestion that, again, the role of religion within the Empire was less of an outright ban on any and all religiosity, and more simply a ban on organized religious worship. Now, we have already seen quite a few overtly religious figures throughout the Horus Heresy, but in this case too, our Silversmith's hero gets a hold of a book filled with old mythical tales and religious iconography of all types. It refers to, amongst other things, the Norse myth of Fenrir, the wolf who ate the sun, and so on. And he then also crafts a reliquary for an iron gauntlet that was taken off an Iron Hand's banner by Pheresmanus himself and offered to the commander of an Imperial Army regiment that had done particularly well in one of the last engagements on Terra against the Terrawat clan, who had apparently decided to try and keep some of their toys for themselves instead of, being good cooperative members of the human species and handing it over to the God Emperor. We also hear a bit more about the Lunar Wolves, who were apparently quite fond of artistic talent as well, including Hustor Sejanus, who came to the Silversmith to have rings produced bearing the various markings of the Mournival. He was also, the Silversmith I'm referring to here, he was the person who created the Lodge medallions that initially clued Garviel Loken onto the existence of the lodges in the first place. And he was killed for the creation of these medallions. This suggests to us that, very clearly, the lodges were already quite far gone, even by the earliest point in time. Like, they had already gotten to the point where human life wasn't really important to them at all. Now, this is interesting because this is the kind of stuff I wish they had done far more of. I often complain that in the Horus Heresy, the bad guy seems to be going from, normal human beings with their own agendas and goals and ideologies to batshit insane, psychopathic, mass-murdering lunatics who rape, murder, and pillage for no other reason than because funny. It's just... And Horus, too. Horus is perhaps the worst offender in this. He goes from being a very balanced, even-minded individual who understands the importance of equality in the upper levels of command, to the point where he will specifically make offerings, just gestures to the crew to reassure them, I'm just like you, so that they respect him more, and also so that he can, smooth their egos out, to building a literal throne room on the Vengeful Spirit, and just killing people. For very little reason, and peeling Erebus's face off with a knife as punishment. It would have been nice if this was a little bit more gradual, and here we do get an example of that, where this member of the Lodge is like, well, this is secret, so kills the Silversmith. And he does it in a drawn-out fashion as well. He's an Astartes. He obviously could have just smashed his skull off with a casual backhand blow if he wanted to. Instead, he reaches out and crushes his windpipe to the point where he can still barely breathe, but not enough to keep him alive. It is a drawn-out death, and he then leaves as well. It doesn't care about his suffering. The only thing he wants to do is keep him alive and in pain for a long period of time, for no practical reason whatsoever beyond being a cunt. And again, that is what I would have liked to have seen far more of before we went full-on cray-cray. Then at the end, Hastur Sejanus barges in and finds the Silversmith lying on the floor and tries to save him, but he doesn't manage it. It's far too late already. Suggesting maybe that Hastur Sejanus was, accidented to death to hide this crime, because he obviously would have been asking questions as well, and yet it didn't really seem to reach any of the upper echelons of the Mournival or Horus or anyone else. See, that's a little bit of the problem of Hastur Sejanus as well, who's described as this really good guy, but we know nothing about him, so I guess we'll just take the book's word for it, I suppose. But that is about all of real interest in the Silversmith, as far as I'm concerned, so I guess we'll move on to Aaron Dembski-Bowden's work then, shall we? Prince of Crows. With Bowden, there is basically one factor that you have to take into consideration whenever reading any of his books. Is it about loyalists? Or is it about traitors? If it's about traitors, as it is in this case, you're pretty much guaranteed a good read, especially when it is about his favored Night Lords. But if it's about loyalists, the results may be somewhat more mixed. Why Black Library even lets him write loyalists anymore, much less the Emperor, goddamn. I have no idea, but here, we don't have to worry about that, because we've got Night Lords, yes indeed. And we find our villainous heroes on the receiving end of a most vicious Dark Angel butt-fucking. Oh yes indeed. You may remember the short story where the Lion discovered the strange device that allowed him much more effective and rapid warp teleportation. This device, tasteless as it is, considering it needs to use the meat puppet of a young child to function properly, has allowed the Dark Angels to fall upon the Night Lords and murder them, effectively ending the, at this point, years-long Thramas crusade in one single vicious engagement. And the poor Night Lords have no clue what just hit them. And so we join 3 Night Lords captains as they try to figure out how badly they've gotten ravaged, what they might be able to do about it, and where to go from here. Savitar is indisposed, presumed dead or captured, and Conrad Curze he has had a rather unkind encounter with the lion, who turned out to be by far the stronger combatant this time around, inflicting upon Conrad Curze 11 wounds that would have killed a space marine straight out. Though, again, that kind of it doesn't really say as much as you think it would you? Because the last time the two fought, I distinctly remember the lion shoving a sword through his guts out his back, and presumably severing his spine in the get-go. So the book telling me that he's mortally wounded now kind of makes me go like, yeah. But is he really, though? We all know he's going to survive this regardless, so, oh well. It is, however, rather interesting to note how they're talking about this incident. There's none of the camaraderie here amongst any of the other legions, not even amongst the traitor legions. They harshly criticize Savitar for trying to rescue Night Lord's elements still trapped on a planet down below, leading to the presumed destruction of his own vessel. And one of them mentions that he had to sacrifice the better half of a company to get the lion to retreat from Curze, and that he regrets giving the order to do so. Imagine that. Imagine that. A Legion captain regretting saving his Primarch's life. Again, Curze always had a strained relationship at best with his Night Lords, but he really was not popular, was he? Hell, even the genetic programming of the Night Lords should have guaranteed, essentially, that they'd place the Primarch's well-being above virtually anything. But he's been enough of a shit to override even that. That's impressive in many, many ways. But at least one of Curze's loyal, heavy quotation marks there, captains, is still alive. Yes, Savitar is of course not dead because he's way too funny of a little bastard to die in an ambush. When he eventually arrives, he simply strides into the chamber containing his 3 fellow captains, fully armed of course, whilst just... Oh god, there needs to be a Savitar movie at some point. There really does. Again, for all the hatred I hold towards Bowden and what he's done to the Emperor, Savitar is a masterpiece, I tell you. He just wanders in there and goes, "I'm sorry I'm late. Small ambush, you see. You may have noticed, but, then again, you were too busy running away, I suppose." Ah, Savitar. You truly are a wonder, aren't you? But unfortunately, these are less than wonderful times. Savitar's fellow captains have decided that the Legion needs to reform as quickly as possible and then strike back against the Dark Angels. Savitar, however, disagrees with this assessment. He is of the opinion that the Dark Angels have beaten their asses so very thoroughly that any future resistance would essentially be pointless at best and suicidal at worst. Savitar instead suggests that either those who wish to do so should be allowed to scatter throughout the galaxy to harass Imperial supply networks, or alternatively, they should form up around him and travel to Terra to take part in the last great battle. And he doesn't expend much in the way of energy in actually convincing his fellow captains of any of this. He simply states that this is what he intends to do, and then calls them morons for considering their own options. Then he leaves the room, pointedly leaving his spear behind, which has a teleportation Homer built into it. Only one of the 3 captains figures what's about to happen and runs out of the room as quickly as he can, just as a group of Night Lord's Terminators manifest in the room and obliterate the other 2 captains. The 3rd captain, the one that escaped, gets to live. Savitar determines that since he was intelligent enough to figure out what was going on, he deserves to be kept alive for a whilst longer. The captain very correctly points out that this is remarkably merciful of Savitar, and Savitar, of course, agrees. before heading off to have a look at his father's condition. And it is indeed grave. Even Savitar is not at all convinced that Curze is going to be pulling through this one, but he's at least a little sad about it, or perhaps confused is a better word. He simply cannot imagine a future without Curze. It seems to him to be a literal impossibility, the very thought that Curze may die here. But he does still take over command of the fleet and enacts his own will in the meantime. Because as he says, whilst Curze may have wished for them to stay and fight the Dark Angels, what possible value is there in the wishes of a dead man? As for Horus's orders, well, Savitar doesn't care. As far as he's concerned, Horus is no different from the Emperor, an uncaring, distant authority figure that has ordered the Night Lords to wander off somewhere and de facto die quietly. Savitar's not particularly interested in that, and so he wishes to break all ties with Horus's rebellion, beyond occasionally utilizing the other legions as convenient allies, of course. Because remember, in a war zone, you don't need to like the guy next to you. All that matters is that he is presenting the enemy with another target to shoot at. And speaking of friends, the Night Lord's Legion suddenly found itself without a command structure. Imagine that. And the only truly surviving member of the old command structure, Savitar, now of course had to figure out who was going to be on the new council, the new ruling body. And so he simply just picks a bunch of people for random selfish reasons, essentially. The primary requirement for becoming a part of the new Night Lord's command structure is that Savitar likes you, and that is about it. I mean, considering how shattered the Legion already is, I suppose this can't possibly do all that much more in the way of harm. After all, the Dark Angels pretty much wiped out a third of the Night Lords in that ambush, and what little remains is scattered across the sector. And now that Savitar basically gives them orders to do whatever they feel like, the Night Lords is pretty much officially no longer a legion at this point. And once Savitar finishes giving his instructions, orders? What do we call it when the highest command authority basically goes, yeah, just do whatever. You know, have fun. Sigh. Savitar then goes to try and fix Conrad Curze, since he thinks he knows what's wrong with him. Though before that, we also get an interesting mention. Savitar is probably one of the best fighters in the entirety of 30k, and he talks about a duel he fought with Sigismund that lasted for 30 hours until Savitar ended the duel by headbutting the captain of the Imperial Fists, therefore breaking the rules of the duel and disqualifying himself. It would have been interesting to see just how closely matched the two would have been with a no-holds-bars fight, but the very fact that they fought for 30 hours probably does suggest that they're pretty damn close. 30 hours. You'd think fatigue would put one of them on their ass at some point, but, well, they are Space Marines after all. Then we get to Savitar actually trying to rescue his Primarch. Savitar apparently has some psychic abilities, and he has also been maintaining a psychic defense for a very long time indeed, preventing Curze from viewing his mind and discerning the manner and time of his death. Because Savitar apparently really doesn't want to know. I presume a deeper reason for that. He delves into Conrad Curze's mind and gets a view of his early life on Nostromo. How he hunted dogs and rats. How he created wonderful little exhibitions killing people, torturing them, placing their heads on spikes, or hanging their flayed corpses out in the open. First, to create a sort of territory for himself, his own hunting grounds, then later on to start guiding and organizing the populace in a better manner, getting them to live like humans instead of animals. And then eventually, of course, he moved on to threaten the highest level of Nostraman society, and demanding that they fall in line or be taken care of, like so many others. It is a fascinating tale, but I've already covered that quite a bit in the course of, 2 videos. I do like this take on Konrad Curze much better than I do the slightly newer one. It does again hint at the idea that Curze actually enjoyed doing what he did, but Curze's own memories does not suggest that, and I think it, again, to be a far more likely explanation that Curze was literally driven insane than necessarily that he started to enjoy it. Savitar mentions that, I'll be with Curze. Curze started cursing out his legion because Savitar asked him, "Lord, why do you hate us?" And Curze then explained to him that the Night Lords are now his ultimate failure. He listened to Fulgrim and Angron talk about how they purged their legions, how they knew precisely whom to get rid of, how they did so in such a surgical and precise fashion, whereas Curze, he's not even sure he would ever stop purging if he got started. He views it as infested, as poisoned, as overrun by the very worst of humanity, dragged from the very absolute depths of Nostramo. And he's not wrong, he is correct. In fact, there was an entire conspiracy within the Night Lord's legions to do just that. To fill the legion with thugs, murderers, rapists, and what's worse, just so that they could organize their own gang cultures within the Legion, and therefore rise to power and prominence, both again within the Legion, and also ensure that their previous gang mates could do so on Nostramo. However, this is of course it's a failure on Curze's part as much as anything else. Was his Legion poisoned? Absolutely. Was he cursed? I'm gonna have trouble with that word. Was he troubled by bad recruits? Absolutely. But Konrad had plenty opportunities to purge his legion of this. Indeed, he was going to present the evidence to Dawn and Fulgrim and get their sanction to do that very thing. But in the end, he never did. He never commanded his legion properly. He allowed the poison as much as anyone else within the legion. And Savitar does point this out to him as well, though he takes it in another direction too. He criticizes Curze's ways, his ruling through fear, and asks what other ways to rule Nostramo had Curze actually tried. I gotta side with Curze on this one, because Nostramo was a blighted hellhole. Literally one of the worst planets in the entire galaxy. I don't even know if there was anything that Konrad could have done to change that in any different fashion, beyond leading a massive and incredibly bloody civil war, I suppose. Because there is genuine value to Konrad's idea that fear leads to compliance, and compliance can avoid bloodshed. Absolutely. This is the very reason why the Emperor created the 8th Legion Astartes in the first place, because he knew that sometimes a deterrent is a far better solution than warfare. I mean, hey, look at nukes in our history. We live in an unprecedented period of peace because everybody knows shit will turn real sour if anyone decides to start wars today. then we get to the other point as well, where Savitar accuses Curze of enjoying the torture. Because Curze, of course, accused Savitar, oh, all of you went corrupt. You started enjoying the fear. The pain became a means to an end in and of itself. They wanted pain for pain's sake, rather than for the effect it had, rather than for its ability to prevent violence. And again, Savitar accuses Curze of the very same thing. He accuses Curze of essentially being the role model for the Legion, that the Legion was cast in his image. And again, I gotta defend Curze here, because Curze was literally insane. Literally. In the most literal and thorough sense imaginable, Curze was insane. The rest of the Nostramans didn't have that excuse. They chose to become vicious murderers and torturers, you know? And you gotta delineate between the two. This is again the reason why I consider Lorgar a monster, whilst I consider Curze a tragic villain. Because one chose to do every horrible thing he did, fully knowing what it was he was doing, whilst the other... Even when Conrad was in complete control of his senses, he was battier than most. Pun intended on the whole Night Lord iconography. And eventually, Curze has had enough of being lectured by one of his murderous captains and throws him out of his mind. Good timing too, because the Night Lord's fleet that remains to Savitar, round about a third of the entire Legion, the rest having either been destroyed or scattered, finds itself under attack once more by the Dark Angels, utilizing their brand new cheat drives. And so we get to see the glory of Savitar as the supreme commander of the Night Lord's Legion in a major fleet engagement. His inspiring orders are: run, or don't, you know. Do whatever you want, but I would like a decent amount of you to stay around and slow down the Dark Angels so those who choose to run get to do so. And in a display of absolutely stunning selflessness and bravery, by Night Lord standards anyways, about half of the fleet actually chooses to fight. Now, yes, you might say that leaves the other 50% to run away, but again, we're talking about the Night Lords here. They're, well, were it not for the fact that they actually can fight, they would de facto be the Skaven of 40k. Could you imagine any circumstance in which 50% of a Skaven army would stay and fight? No? Well, there you go then. A remarkable achievement indeed. Savitar's inspired leadership continues as he asks the Admiral of the fleet, what are you going to do about it? And then just okays that. Oh. I love Savitar because any other main character would immediately grasp the reins of command and come up with some bullshit plan and wrestle with command. He'd be in there, actiony, doing things, organizing, ordering. He'd suddenly be the best he can be, like we saw with a certain captain at Fal, for example. Savitar? No. He is so entirely aware of his own limitations. It's glorious. Oh, he is a wonderful character, he truly is. Amazingly enough, his plan, or, well, more correctly, the Admiral's plan seems like a fairly good one. Take the remains of the 8th Legion, hammer it straight through the 1st, hoping to rake their fleet, overwhelming it with sheer speed and ferocity of the assault, and break out on the other side of it. This would also allow them a very good shot at the Lion's flagship. And seeing as he had been quite mean to their own Primarch, this was undoubtedly something the Night Lords would have found to be apt. Absolutely. Unfortunately, Curze then awakens and decides, fuck this plan. Instead, let me ram my own ship into the middle of all of this nonsense, breaking up the 8th Legion's formation, putting pay to any hope of simply smashing straight through the Dark Angels and then escape, and instead order Savitar and all of his company's marines to board the Lion's flagship. That way, we can kill the maximum number of Night Lords. At the minimum cost of Dark Angel lives. Sometimes I almost wonder which side Curze is actually on. Savitar seems to share my view on this as well, as he comments that whilst discipline is unbearably dull, it does have practical military applications, as demonstrated by this. Unfortunately for Savitar, whilst the rest of his first company is able to make the journey over to the Lion's flagship using teleportation chambers or boarding pods, before he manages to reach any of these alternatives, his ship loses all power as the reactor dies in its heart, leaving Savitar stuck, whilst all of his brothers are fighting and dying on the Dark Angel's vessel. He can't have that, so he orders one of his fighter pilots to return to the craft so that he may climb on top of the Voidcraft, and then fly over to the Dark Angel's vessel. At first, he's planning to simply jump off at speed, which I do love. He's like, oh yeah, I'm tough enough to survive this. Like, fuck you are. How fast is this thing going? How many thousands of kilometers per hour? Yeah, no, I don't think that would work. And the pilot of the fighter doesn't think so either. So instead, she flies straight into one of the hangars aboard the Dark Angel ship and then dumps him right in the middle of it. Now, how the hell she manages that? So, one would presume that all of the various point defenses on such a vessel must be primed and ready to target anything that is not emitting the correct IFFF, surely. Identify friend foe, obviously. They've got that technology in 40k. And yet, she manages this. Again, surely, the hangar entrances must be some of the most heavily defended sections on such a ship. And even if they were not, inside, they even mention that there are gun crews and defensive turrets inside the hangar, and yet, apparently, they don't notice until the craft, which, by the way, looks nothing like what the Dark Angel is using, just slows to a halt and, deposits our Night Lord hero, quote-unquote, in the hangar, and then starts blasting everything to pieces. Well, I mean, this is just classic. I complain about this a lot, but isn't it strange how in most Dembski novels, the reason why the bad guys get away with it is because the loyalists are fucking morons? I'm not going to delve into that here, but bear in mind, you'll see how often it's true. Anyways, now that Savitar has gotten aboard the Dark Angel's flagship, he of course runs immediately towards the loudest source of gunfire present, where he finds Conrad Curze leading what remains of the Atramantar, only about half of them left now, that's the elite Terminator Corps of the Night Lords, along with a few hundred of his own legionnaires. They are currently completely and utterly surrounded by the Dark Angels and getting their shit kicked in. The Night Lords often get a lot of flack for being kind of terrible at fighting, and in part they are, simply because they do not possess the discipline of many of the other legions, but they can be as good a fighting force as any other of the Legionis Astartes, but their leadership sure doesn't make it easy, does it? When Savitar finally arrives, he's far too late to really do much about anything. Curze is too busy fighting the Lion, and this time around he doesn't really have any tricks to play. The Lion has got his number now and is easily outmatching the Night Lord's Primarch. As for the rest of the poor Night Lords, they are surrounded, outnumbered, and trapped in an absolutely horrible position because Curze just, wandered through the ship and wherever he went, the Night Lords followed, because, well, I guess they've never learned their lesson, have they? The fight is short and exceptionally one-sided, and the Dark Angels decide to take prisoners, which, I gotta say, kinda shocks me. Why? I mean, I know why. Why? Because Savitar needs to still live, and he needs to have a way to try and escape, and he needs a handful of Night Lords with him to try and do that. There is a hilarious scene where they put him in a normal cell, and he just, because he's got acid spittle, just spits his way through a wall and then just sits there, waiting for the next group of Dark Angels to pass by, at which point he just points at the wall and goes, I think rats did it. They once. And then he's thrown into a force field cell along with several other of his comrades. Some Matrimentar are still alive then. Why the Dark Angels didn't just shoot them, I have no idea. I mean, capturing Conrad makes a degree of sense because he's a Primarch, but the rank and file? Why? And the Night Lords as well, the least sympathetic of all the legions. I really don't see the point in it, but, again, we know why Savitar needs to escape, blah, 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 but still. We finally also get an interesting look into Savitar's own past. Apparently, he could speak to animals, crows in particular, and he fed them breadcrumbs and dead little boys. Because apparently these are the carnivorous kinds of crows. To be fair, I'm pretty sure Jesus. You know, the blackbirds. I'm pretty sure they do eat meat if given the opportunity, and this particular bunch seemed quite fond of it. They even have little conversations with the young Savitar, and the flapping of their wings somehow calms his mind, because at this point he hasn't learned how to control his psychic powers yet, and it is only around the birds that he can get restful sleep. That is interesting. We need more Savitar. Again, I would have preferred his survival be more due to his own tactical acumen rather than Loyalists being retarded again, but hey, more Savitar is never a bad thing. And so the book concludes. A good portion of the Night Lord's fleet is still heading towards Terra. Those elements that ignored Curze's orders to board the Dark Angel's flagship, being able to mostly break through the First Legion's navy and escape. At least some of them. As for the other ones who fled, they've definitely got the best chance. Whether or not they would arrive at Terra in anything that even remotely resembled organization or coherence, doubtful. In fact, we know they didn't. This was de facto the last major combat action of the 8th Legion Astartes. Beyond this point, they are no longer a legion, they are no longer a unified command structure, they are merely a random scattering of warbands, essentially. In conclusion, it's a good story. I love Savitar. I absolutely adore Savitar. We get a bit of the usual loyalist retardations, but, whenever you're reading Bowden, you kind of have to take the rough with the smooth, So he has given us Savitar, and Savitar is an absolutely awesome character, so we shall have to forgive him for that. As to what happens to him next, well, I guess we'll have to wait and see. We kind of know what is going to happen to Curze, of course. He is going to escape, or more correctly, he's going to be forced to escape, so that he will eventually end up on Sagulsa when he can go completely mad and decide to let himself be killed by an Imperial assassin, so as to prove to himself and everyone else that, no, he actually did see the future. This totally wasn't avoidable at all. His tortured mind eventually breaking the poor Conrad Curze. Tragic story indeed. Anywho, this has been a long one, so until next time, thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Though, bear in mind, I am going on my summer vacation now, so for the next couple of weeks, you'll be getting some guest videos, and then I'll be back after that again. Till then, have a good day.